He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Right now, the two main public media networks in the US face bids to defund them, even though their federal funding is tiny. And they also face MAGA-driven inquiries into bias and how they stay in business. Public broadcasters elsewhere in the world are also facing more political pressure on their funding these days and even their legitimacy. So this week we asked the boss of the outfit that represents public broadcasters around the world, how do you defend against defunding? Also, school lunches have been in the headlines ever since the new cheaper factory-to-classroom ones appeared this year, or not, in some cases. So just teething troubles blown out of proportion, partly because of politics? Or are our media rightly demanding more transparency? Well, certainly more than you find on the cellophane lids of those badly burned boxes of bolognese that we've all seen on the news. That's later on Mediawatch, but first, Chinese warships appearing in what we like to think of as our benign strategic environment sparked something of a media frenzy lately, culminating in commentators claiming our defence spending's going to have to go up ASAP.
Good to have you on the show. Have we had any word from the Chinese yet?
No, well, my advice is that we were not informed or have not been informed by the Chinese government why this task group has been deployed into our region, and we've not been informed what its future plans are.
That was the Defence Minister Judith Collins talking to Ryan Bridge on News Talk ZB's Drive Show on Friday last week, the day that we and Australia learned that Chinese warships were in the Tasman Sea for the first time, that we know of, and that they didn't give us much warning. Now, Judith Collins didn't sound awfully worried. It was part of the challenging time we now live in, she said, and that's prompted governments all around the world to up their defence plans and spending. So Ryan Bridge asked Judith Collins a question that's been raised again and again since then.
Are you getting more money for this budget for defence?
Oh, well, you'll just have to wait and see. I'm a happy little pixie, actually, being Minister of Defence at the moment.
All right.
But we're very clear. We have to spend more on defence.
Will we hit 2%?
No, you have to wait and see. But Brian, I'll come on your show and talk about it.
All right, you keep watching those Chinese vessels in the meantime, eh?
So cordial relations there between ZB and the Defence Minister 10 days ago. 1 week later, with the Prime Minister and his deputy both elsewhere in Asia, Acting Prime Minister David Seymour told reporters this.
We need to invest more, and personally, I actually think that the Chinese have made a tactical error because they have alerted the New Zealand public that the world is changing.
Now, it's either pretty brave or a bit reckless to criticise China's tactics and then tell them they've awoken the dragon of New Zealand public opinion. But initially, it wasn't easy to work out just how seriously our media were taking this. For instance, the Weekend Herald ran a small story on page 7 based on Judith Collins calling it a wake-up call the day after the news first broke. But the Herald on Sunday the next day had War Games in capitals on its front page, and then a full rundown on military and diplomatic moves in the South Pacific on the inside pages. But on Monday, the naval incursion was deep in the paper again, with just a cut-down earlier published RNZ story at the bottom of page 10. Though a reader from Remuera on the letters page pointed out that we sent a warship to the contested waters of the Taiwan Strait back in 2017. And in fact, we did it again just last September, along with an Australian ship, a routine activity, Judith Collins said, and the handful of news stories about that in our media at that time. But that same day on News Talk ZB in Wellington, it was the Tasman Sea naval drama that drew a range of armchair admirals and deck chair diplomats to call in with advice on how to handle China, including Jan, who thought it was no coincidence that the Australian Foreign Minister is Penny Wong.
That she's Chinese, number one.
Oh no!
Number two,
Come on, Jan. Come on, Jan. She's born in Australia. Oh, come on, get on with it, Jan. She's Malaysian. She's not even Chinese. She's Malaysian.
Host Nick Mills there shutting that down as fast as he could. Another caller then told him that Rocket Lab could be the key to our defence policy, and in his defence, former Aussie Prime Minister Scott Morrison was in the country and on TVNZ's Q&A show last Sunday, saying Rocket Lab really could be an AUKUS asset. And then another ZB caller harked back to a proposal from the past to lease Ohakea Air Force Base in Manawatu to Singapore to train pilots.
Which National was all for, and then the Ardern government and the Fairy Green Party decided, no, we're not going to do that. Or maybe we should be going back to Singapore and saying, hey, look, if you guys still want to set up your fighters here and all that sort of thing for your training, we don't have a problem. We've got a an armed sort of fighting wing to our Air Force, which is there, I presume, at our beck and call, and they're paying us to be here.
Now, it turns out that was proposed by Singapore 8 years ago when John Key was our Prime Minister. It was, in fact, NZ first Ron Mark, as Defence Minister in a Labour-led government, who decided the idea wasn't really worth it. In 2023, Newsroom's foreign editor Sam Sachdeva acquired previously unreported cabinet papers which showed that Singapore's American F-15 planes were actually among the noisiest in the world, and 75% of Sanson residents would have needed acoustic insulation, adding millions to the cost of the proposal. Military planning then is clearly complicated stuff, though ZB caller Ted made it sound so simple last Monday.
The Chinese people in their mess will be into their noodles and they'll be pissing themselves listening to this radio station right now. Why don't we just invoke CETO? End of story, solves the problem. And meanwhile, bring in conscription, no problem. End of. Done.
Conscription here won't help keep foreign vessels out of the Tasman Sea, and as for firing up the Southeast Asian Treaty Organisation, that's easier said by Ted than done. New Zealand was never actually a member of the anti-communist alliance that was formed 70 years ago, and it was dissolved in mid-1977 after most of its members lost interest and withdrew. But by now, the calls to hike up defence spending were being reported as well. And when the Prime Minister told RNZ he wanted to get New Zealand's defence spending up to close to 2% of GDP, the ACT Party rushed out a statement hailing this as an emerging triumph for itself. Since the new US President was inaugurated, ACT's defence spokesperson Mark Cameron has been saying New Zealand must invest in defence or risk isolation with Trump 2.0.
So how much more money are we talking about spending in dollar terms?
Oh, it's about $3.5 billion. It's a significant investment. But I make the point, Tim, we've got to invest in our people and the kit that they use and play our part. We're no longer in this benign state, sadly.
That was Mark Cameron on ZB back in mid-January, long before any Chinese ships showed up. But this week, Canterbury University's Anne-Marie Brady told RNZ New Zealand must muscle up its defence spending, and she cited Chinese media.
Well, People's Daily says that what's going on is that the Southern Theatre Command has deployed naval and air forces for training exercises in the high seas and far seas drills in the Pacific. So that's not business as usual as China, and it's a shot across the bow. It's a signal to New Zealand and Australia that China's preparing for regular deployment in the South Pacific.
The People's Daily, of course, amplifies the voice of the People's Republic of China's government, especially on matters of the People's Liberation Army. Now, just days after those ships appeared in the Tasman, the daily podcast The Detail, co-produced by RNZ and Newsroom, featured former Defence Minister Ron Mark and Victoria University's David Capey urging an upping of the defence budget, with presenter Sharon Brett-Kelly setting the scene this way.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Like it or not, we've needed to spend more money on defence for years, and today it's even more urgent.
And on News Talk ZB this week, Canterbury Morning's host John McDonald addressed the Defence Minister personally.
Spend up large, Judith. Spend up large. Spend up big and drag our military into the 21st century.
Now, while all this makes it sound like a budget boost for defence is a done deal, sealed by the Chinese incursion this past week, we probably would have boosted the budget anyway, especially for our Navy. Last December, Parliament's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee was told by the heads of both the New Zealand Defence Force and the Ministry of Defence almost all of our ships are due to be replaced within the next decade. And on scoop.co.nz, columnist Gordon Campbell said, all this is going to be pricey, even more so if a panic button is pressed in haste over this week's crisis.
In all likelihood, the coalition government will simply want to settle on a number for future defence spending that will be big enough to satisfy our critics in Canberra and Washington. Any critics at home will be painted as naive and unwilling to make the hard sacrifices.
And Gordon Campbell's got a pretty long perspective on this. For example, almost exactly 40 years ago for The Listener magazine, he was covering the controversy over New Zealand doing big deals for frigates, and that was at a time when we were seriously estranged from Australia and the US. And any plan made and money spent now will also take years to pay off, Gordon Campbell pointed out. And that point was also made in 2016, when a white paper called for a big defence boost, and then it was New Zealand First saying the government must double it to 2% of GDP. Now, at the time, the Dominion Post said the spending was at 1% because the voters knew at that point there was no serious threat to New Zealand. But it also said the Defence White Paper was vague about what the boosted Defence Force might be for and where it might be expected to go. And the same could be said of responses to the Chinese vessels which were here last week and then gone again by the middle of this one. Last weekend here on Mediawatch, we looked at how our government is following Australia's lead on how to support local media in a market where a handful of lightly regulated, mega-profitable offshore platforms are getting the lion's share of crucial revenue and not paying much tax here. The Australian federal government had been gearing up to introduce a new system of charging online platforms with substantial Australian revenues. They called it the News Bargaining Initiative. And our Media Minister Paul Goldsmith said he was waiting to see how that plays out. But it turns out it may not play out at all. The Trump administration has said it will retaliate against any country deemed to be penalising US companies with what it calls discriminatory measures. And the Sydney Morning Herald has reported Australian officials have now opted to delay. Meanwhile, in the US, the media are being buffeted by Trump as well. AP, the world's biggest news agency, has been kicked out of the White House, reportedly, for not adopting Trump's terminology such as the Gulf of America. AP went to court on the basis that the presidency can't decide who gets to report on it. But yes, we can, and we are, White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt told the press pool last Tuesday.
Asking the President of the United States questions in limited spaces, such as the Oval Office in Air Force One, is a privilege that unfortunately has only been granted to a few. It is not a legal right for all. The Trump administration has already proven to be the most transparent ever.
Also this week, outlets including NPR, National Public Radio, were asked to leave long-held office space at the Pentagon, and the public broadcasting system PBS, most famous for making Sesame Street for about half a century, has shut its Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Office after President Trump issued executive orders to curtail DEI initiatives. But even though both of those national public service networks receive tiny sums in federal finance in the US, that's under threat as well. The new head of the Federal Communications Commission has ordered an investigation into how NPR and PBS use their commercial revenues and underwrite local stations to keep them going. And the bosses of both those broadcasters have also been asked to testify before a Department of Government Efficiency committee to respond to accusations of systematically biased content. That committee is headed by MAGA stalwart Senator Marjorie Taylor Greene, who called for all foreign press to be kicked out of the White House last month. And even before the last election, she was telling foreign journalists where to go herself.
The left and the media spreads more conspiracy theories. We like the truth. We like supporting our Constitution, our freedoms, and America first. So
what about Jewish space lasers? Tell us about Jewish space lasers.
No, why don't you go talk about Jewish space lasers? And really, why don't you off? How about that?
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Now, all this political pressure is a worry for the Public Media Alliance, an umbrella group for public service broadcasters all around the world, which includes PBS in America and RNZ here. Indeed, RNZ's Chief Executive Paul Thompson is the current PMA Chair, and RNZ's Chair Dr Jim Mather is a member of the PMA's Global Task Force, which has been formed to defend the values and interests of public media. And they fired that up because the legitimacy and financing of national public broadcasters is being challenged right now in many places. The UK-based CEO of the Public Media Alliance is Christian Porter.
We're seeing this, increasingly around the world. There are these defund movements. You've probably seen it here. You know, trends on social media, hashtag defund, and it could be hashtag defund BBC, it could be hashtag defund CBC in Canada. Movements are picking up pace, often because of quite simplistic arguments around, well, hey, you're paying your tax, you're paying this extra tax towards this independent public broadcaster. Why are you paying this when you could just use Netflix. You've got Disney. You've got everything else. Now, the first thing I'd say is who are the detractors first? What is their agenda? Is from an opposition party, for example, that's had a bad experience being held to account by a public broadcaster, for example. Who is it? So that's the first thing to look at. The second thing is looking at what their argument is. Now, what do you pay for with your license fee or your tax towards that public broadcaster? Is it, do you appreciate the local services it offers, the weather reports, the news, the broad array of entertainment and content, the many radio stations that you might have, the journalists placed around the country that you live in, or do you just want the sheer entertainment from Netflix? Will Netflix ever provide, or Disney or whoever, will they ever provide those services that your public broadcaster offers you, which is also bound by a set of values that you might sort of trust? But you know what it's like. If you start sort of shouting about how good you are doing something, a lot of people get put off, right? They're like, ugh, I don't want to hear that. Right. So how do you reach through?
Or it ends up sounding too defensive, I guess, is the other possibility.
It does.
The PMA has what's called a global task force, and in fact, RNZ's own chair, Jim Mather, is on that. It says here on the website, to defend the values and interests of public media. Is that the purpose of this, that your group can then kind of almost represent or inject itself into this debate?
So we can act directly and respond to crises. So like you said about Switzerland, there's a consultation at the moment about defunding the Swiss public broadcasters' international services, which we are fully against, because they act as a very good, strong deterrent and part of the solution around disinformation and misinformation coming into the country. So we support our member there. Another way of doing it is, well, how do we best coordinate a more global response, if you like? There are all these pressures on public broadcasters that don't just happen in places with diminished press freedom. They're happening in places with, quite high levels of press freedom.
Like Switzerland, I imagine, would be. But does that mean like you would, as the PMA, attend a parliamentary hearing in Switzerland on this proposal to defund? Or something? Would you be that active, or is it all just putting out statements?
If we're invited, and if we're to respond to a consultation, yes, we'd do that. But I suppose with the Global Task Force, the reason why that was set up, and with PMA's support, the idea is that it's often difficult for public broadcasters to speak out as organisations, but is there a way in which we can take the voices of some prominent individuals from within those organisations to speak out on key issues? The Global Task Force is there to respond to more sort of pointed issues. Sometimes it's quite effective to get the names of people, prominent people, into the press or to make statements like this. It has a different tone, has a different effect. The rest of us can also find ways of getting together more cohesively every month to talk about key issues, to actually exchange information. What are the challenges that you face on the ground? So it's not just an outward thing. It is a very important facility for us to share information, to support each other in the challenges that we individually face.
So just as an example, there was a bit of a flurry last year, I'm sure you're aware of it, where X, formerly Twitter, suddenly branded a whole lot of broadcasters, including RNZ, as state-affiliated, to which, you look at that and think, hang on, we're not like KCNA of North Korea or anything like that. It's not the voice of the state. It's so when something like that happens, do you get involved in that to try and push back?
Yeah, that was one of our more successful pushbacks, I suppose, because that is disinformation. You are simplistically labelling a public broadcaster and public broadcasters around the world, and that's a real issue for trust. But when someone says it's a state broadcaster, most people in, say, a place like New Zealand will go, whoa. So what? So is that a government media? Even though it's untrue, it has the ability to sow distrust or greater distrust in those organisations based on a fallacy.
Now, the system in the US is very different. They don't have a sort of state-funded type public broadcaster like a CBC or BBC or even RNZ. But right now, they've got bills before Congress about revoking federal funding for the public broadcasting they have. The heads of NPR and PBS have been in hearings and come out saying, we're under attack here, our very future's at stake. Are you getting involved in that, or is the whole situation in the United States with the shrinking of the state and its the things it funds and all of that, which seems to be being gone through now by Elon Musk's department, is that in your orbit at all, or are you worried about the fallout from it if it spreads to other countries?
Yeah, I'm very worried. I think public broadcasting in the US is a very different story. like you said, to so many other public broadcasting models around the world. They're very mixed funding. They often rely on what we call, I suppose, simplistically philanthropic funding in part as well. But they also receive some federal funding.
And local stations, locally staffed, and all of that.
But they are independent. And I think where in a country where there's quite there's a very strong commercial press, there is, and there's a strong, very vocal president and leadership, there needs to be a public broadcaster to hold all of those things to account, to be a place for trusted information that is impartial, that has due impartiality built into its editorial values. When our member organisations are being, pulled in front of a court in some cases, or asked to give sort of responses to government in the way that they've been asked, then we will work with them. Sometimes it doesn't, an international organisation like ours just jumping in won't necessarily be helpful. And, especially in a local level, public service media in the US is often the only source of trusted news and information. They have many public media stations across the US. It's such a fragmented system, but it's an important one. I think in a country where over 2,000 local newspapers have shut down in recent years, what fills the gap? And also, if you create vacuums, I think in whatever country you are, when you create vacuums of trusted news, you've got to think about who fills that gap.
Well, with that in mind, this very week that we're speaking here, one of our main commercial, privately owned news publishers has just announced a shrinking of a restructure of its newsroom, which involves a lot fewer journalists and some senior ones, some very well-known names leaving. That's been happening all year. It's part of a trend of fewer and fewer journalists and fewer companies able to do kind of public good type news. That means that RNZ, where we're a relatively small organisation, but we're filling a larger space in the media because of it. And if so, does it change the mission as far as you're concerned?
They don't always become bigger. They're still under pressure themselves. I think a reduced media...
But they become bigger players in the system.
They become a big player.
Everything else around them is shrinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And that comes with its own risk. They have a different funding models. If you receive public funding, you're not going through the same challenges as maybe or commercial players might. The responsibility becomes bigger, but also sometimes there is... your success can also be an issue. So when you've got real challenges in the commercial market, often you'll find that in some countries, I'm thinking of some in Europe in particular, there is then more of a rallying against the public broadcaster because people see it as having an unfair advantage.
Privilege somehow.
Yeah, and it's not the case. It's a bit of an unfair and quite simplistic argument. Public media should exist in a plural media environment, but it doesn't necessarily. Public service broadcasting, there is evidence out there that shows that it doesn't have an unfair advantage in that it doesn't really disadvantage the commercial players by there being a public broadcaster. RNZ has a crisis role in the country as well, a country that faces natural hazards. And also, I think looking outwardly really says something about a country's democracy when there is support, whether that's in public funding, public support, or even political support for there being an independent public broadcaster. It really shows that there is a care for democracy and that idea of there being a plurality of information, but also something that people can go to in times of crisis, that they can trust for news.
Last year you had your gathering in Ottawa and you released the Ottawa Declaration. There was concern about disinformation, social media platforms, and they said they need to be distributing the free flow of reliable news and information on fair terms. But now that we see them all lining up with Donald Trump, is there anything that can be done to bring companies to heel if they are putting out disinformation and imposter content, as that Ottawa Declaration put it?
Disinformation is a huge issue for democracies around the world. It's a huge issue for us all. It takes up a lot of time to disprove the sheer amount of disinformation that's out there as well. There's a huge pressure on public broadcasters. And there's a big question, and there has been for years now, about whether public service media as trusted entities, as the broadcasters, as the news sources that are, by and large around the world, the most trusted outlets in their countries, whether they should have a presence on social media. Now, I think pulling away, I wouldn't ever condone that, because you're not going to win in pulling our audience to you, especially audiences who increasingly are just using Facebook, X, whatever the platform is. Those platforms don't create news. Mm-hmm. To source news and information. People, by and large, go to them during, first thing in the morning when they wake up. They turn, you've got to think about audience habits. So So there's a real need for public service media and trusted news media, all of them, to be on those platforms. But it's all about, can your brand push through? Is your brand visible?
But if you're in a situation, even advertisers saying, I don't know if this Facebook is a brand safe environment.
Well, that's my next point. I think
so public broadcasters don't want to be in that position either.
I think you've got to then think about who owns these platforms and what allegiances are they making as well. How much they are businesses after all. In India, for example, when there's been evidence where if YouTube has been asked to pull content by the government, they've pulled it. If that's the case, and then we're seeing this alignment of
that wouldn't happen with a smaller government, right?
Well, if we're seeing the alignment of these big tech platforms and say Trump, for example, we've got to ask serious questions about. Yeah, you're right, absolutely right. But I think public broadcasters need to be present there. But it's how you're present, trying to redirect people back to your websites where they can actually safely find sources of information. Now, in Canada, a couple of years ago, when Meta stopped allowing the news to be published across its platforms, that's a real issue, because if you've got a population that, especially in parts of northern Canada, rural Canada, that go to Facebook first to source and find sources of news, then if suddenly trusted sources of news that are locally relevant, like CBC Radio Canada, are not there, especially in times of crisis, like if there's a forest fire, for example, where are people able to source news and information? It's a real challenge.
Yeah, so that's a stick that Facebook has over countries that challenge them.
I think they should always try and push back. We're seeing, especially with AI now, we've seen some research out of the BBC recently, which I think came out last week, which was essentially looking at how major AI platforms summarize news and how accurate that is. Now, if around 50 to 51% of AI summarizations of new BBC News content had serious issues.
We had that just last week. RNZ's Ben Strang testing AI and finding out that Google's AI delivering names suppressed by the courts. AI was sourcing information from social media where the names were circulating freely in breach of court orders in a way that could. So there's nothing in the AI tech that would stop that from happening. The PMA runs responsible AI masterclasses. What's responsible and irresponsible use of AI?
AI is going to be here whether we like it or not. And there are some fantastic uses for it. It makes work, our lives in some cases, more efficient. It can, and depending on how we use it, in terms of, it's a great example from the Financial Times in the UK, where they used AI to help moderate their comment feeds to make sure that their actual, the human moderators can spend more time building community around those comments. It makes it more of an interesting environment. So that's a really good way of freeing up humans to do what they do best.
But in these masterclasses, what are you telling your members not to do?
So we are looking at the core values of public service media. Does that use of AI support your core values? And what we're doing at the moment is talking to people about creating this sort of checklist against your values of where you roll out AI. And going back to our point about ownership and social media, these AI models are owned by various organizations, stakeholders in various countries. So if you are going to use a third-party app, for example, especially as a trusted news organization, do we know where the data is then going for and being used? Responsible AI is also making sure that your audiences trust that you're using it in a way that's not going to impact the quality of your journalism, the accuracy of your journalism, for example. And also, audiences are still, by and large, skeptical of AI. They might be increasingly using it, but there was research from last year from the Reuters Institute that showed, I think it was between 30 and 40% of people are skeptical of there being any sort of AI use in the creation of news content, for example. And creating a bit of a traffic light system around that. If it's an absolute red, don't use it.
So you're not educating your members in these masterclasses or in whatever policies you might have, not telling them, don't use it to write news.
I'll always personally prefer the human way. I'll always, that's just what I trust, and it's my understanding of journalism and working with public broadcasters around the world is that's the most effective. But there are efficiencies we need, and the pace of news production is only ever going to go up. So it's accepting that people are going to use AI, and let's just make it obvious where we are using it, and always making sure that there's a human check sign off on these. Your editorial values ensure that there is a human sign-off on the production of news. There's an opportunity, especially for smaller public broadcasters, smaller news organisations, to also catch up and produce more quality news. There is that opportunity through this. But I just say, be absolutely, clear on where you're using it. Make sure that people can still come to you and know that they can trust you in your use of AI. And that's what people want to see. I'm not going to sit here and tell people how to use the AI. What I'd rather is sit there and say, look, let's look at it in an ethical and moral way, and that is bound by your values.
That was Christian Porter, the Chief Executive of the Public Media Alliance, an umbrella group for public service broadcasters all around the world, who was in New Zealand recently. And finally on Mediawatch this week, the headlines about school lunches haven't been great lately for the makers of them or for the political backers of the new cheaper scheme, Ka Ora Ka Ako.
Nutritionist finds litany of issues with new school lunches.
There was a headline from rnz.co.nz after Checkpoint on Monday, and the story was republished in many other outlets too. And the same day,
joy and nourishment gone.
That was the headline on a Stuff story all about the local projects that the new factory-to-classroom system has replaced. The next day, Business Desk had this.
Schools anxious about huge allergy risk as MPI investigates.
And there was this from RNZ also on Tuesday.
11 days of butter chicken.
That was Checkpoint again, and that was just 2 days' worth of negative news. But there was plenty more where that came from about school lunches. Unlike the new cheaper lunches, which are smaller and insufficiently calorific, according to food health expert Boyd Swinburne, talking to RNZ's Checkpoint last Monday. And he also said too many of them are going to waste.
This is just from anecdotal reports. On the previous version, the old model, they hadn't got around to measuring waste, so we don't know exactly what that was.
And anecdotal was the key word there. Even after Checkpoint finally got School Lunch Collective boss Paul Harvey on the show last Wednesday, it was hard work getting a single stat out of him.
Is that the kind of figures you've got, 50% wastage at some schools?
They aren't the figures that we see, but again, every school, Lisa...
So give me a figure then.
No, Lisa, I'm just telling you, every school we're listening to and we're adapting to make sure that we're making progress with them going forward.
Now, in the absence of meaningful figures, many opinions and comments about school lunches have filled the void, and also more reports on isolated incidents of the wrong kind of food, like supposedly halal stuff with ham in it, and a vegan-labelled meal that was also clearly labelled as savoury mince. But there is, of course, another way of looking at all this. A free lunch should be choice, even if you don't quite get your choice of lunch. And among those 11 days of butter chicken, there were also 6 days of other stuff at Lincoln Heights School. A menu variety issue was all the School Lunch Collective boss would concede on Checkpoint, by the way. And as RNZ reported in mid-February, nearly a third of schools receiving lunches have contacted the Ministry of Education with queries and complaints. But queries are not the same as complaints, and 2/3 of schools clearly didn't raise any issues at all. Now, a month ago, ZB's Mike Hosking even told his listeners that positive comments from schools had been excluded from TV news reports.
On the 6 o'clock news TVNZ that evening, footage from Seymour's visit, including footage of the students eating the lunches. However, none of their comments were broadcast. Instead, there was only one, a voiceover, which focused exclusively on the negative aspects of the story, and then a video clip of the principal of another school who was reinforcing that narrative. Understandably, the students were surprised the next day to find out that the national news channel had come all the way to their school to film, then opted not to air a single one of their comments. One could be forgiven for inferring that TVNZ excluded their voices because they did not fit its overly negative narrative on the government's policy.
Now, one might also be forgiven, using Mike Hosking's own words there, for inferring that he was flat out accusing TVNZ of political bias there, though Mike Hosking went on to diffuse that with a rather vague shot at news media generally.
That all it does is go and reinforce in a lot of people's minds what's wrong with the media, is they are determined to make it a negative story, and they are determined to find whiners and moaners and whingers. And they set out to do it, and unless you say the right thing, they're not interested in you.
But there was also little doubt in his mind that that new lunch program was good, even before it had delivered a single lunch, as we'll hear in a minute. Now, the man behind the lunch switch, Associate Education Minister David Seymour, has also said that the media don't make as many stories out of the urgently needed savings generated by his cut price plan as they do about all the teething troubles. But noting that Minister David Seymour recently told Newsroom this...
We're getting a lot of feedback from principals who actually say they believe that their children think that the food is better than the previous offerings.
RNZ's Phil Pennington then asked for this feedback last week, though the eventual response from the Ministry of Education was this.
I don't believe there is an official record of positive comments from schools maintained.
The suppliers, School Lunch Collective, referred Phil Pennington to its PR company Acumen and also to the biggest contractor in the lunch scheme, international outfit Compass Group, but neither supplied any feedback, good or bad, though David Seymour's office and the ministry eventually did, and that included this comment from one student.
Once again, I ate it. Lol. It was good for $3 and the perfect amount of hot food. And the yoghurt and chips. Great.
And it was a good job they mentioned the yoghurt and the chips. This week, Business Desk revealed that Compass has also been awarded an extra $8.9 million to supply additional yoghurt, snacks and fruit, cutting into the projected savings a bit. And that's a bit of information that we wouldn't have now if Cecile Meyer of Business Desk hadn't been inquiring. And if Hawke's Bay Today hasn't visited Herotonga Intermediate in Hastings last week, well, they wouldn't have reported that the school lunch agreement stated that a school must check with the ministry before they make any public comments about ka ora ka ako. Based on feedback, it is clear that clause does not meet our intent, so we will remove it, the ministry said to Hawke's Bay Today. So schools are now free to promote or speak about their school lunches to their communities without any contractual restrictions or negative repercussions, the ministry said, after Hawke's Bay Today had flagged it. Good to know. But was Mr Seymour and News Talk ZB's Mike Hosking actually right about the media accentuating the negative? Well, if we go back to the day that the new service was unveiled and samples were displayed to invited media, Mike Hosking boldly declared that the school lunch problem had been solved.
You've solved the problem. You've irrefutably solved the problem. At $3, I saw what you served up. I see it. I get it. It's edible. You fixed the problem. Yet people still don't want to see that it's fixed, indicating that there are people who literally will not accept that you're right and you've delivered.
But of course, nothing had been delivered at that point, and when the rubber hit the road this school year, some meals were not delivered, and some were clearly not as nutritious and delicious as David Seymour promised back then to Newshub.
So you will continue to deliver nutritious, delicious lunches?
I think nutritious and delicious are great words, and I think they could apply to what we're going to announce.
Meanwhile, on the School Lunch Collective's own website, they were promising this.
With hand-picked seasonal produce that's carefully loaded and transported right here to our central kitchen facility.
And in that video, there were lots of seedlings and soil and sunshine and smiles, not much mirroring the not especially seasonal-looking reheated stuff that we've seen pictured in our media this past month. Now, the biggest contractor in all this is the huge UK-based Compass Group, which already has lucrative institutional contracts here and whose lacklustre meals prompted protests outside Dunedin Hospital back in 2016. And last October, Mike Hosking asked David Seymour about the possibility of problems with Compass.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, you've got big contractors providing large amounts of meals, and the risk is always that once you're in the door, the quality of the contracting declines. But, I mean, this is not new. We know that. And what we've done is been alert to the challenges that other government departments, such as Defence, for example, have had with the same contractors. We've said, I think we can make it work. They said, yes, we can. And we've basically built into our contract really strict monitoring so that we can ensure the quality stays up.
But with ka ora ka ako, the problem hasn't been the quality failing once Compass is in the door, but poor quality right at the start, and lunches not even getting to the school's doors at lunchtime. Just last week, Mike Hosking told his listeners that the Manurewa Marae electoral data inquiry was all about a lack of oversight, and that this was symptomatic of what he called the gargantuan hopelessness of our public service.
A combination of one, not really having any oversight on information that may or may not be protected, may or may not be inappropriately used, and two, when concerns were raised, still doing nothing about it. High trust models were in place. The high trust model.
So with that in mind, it is odd that Mike Hosking should be taking it on trust that the new multi-million-dollar school lunches setup is working and will deliver, and that he's critical of the media for their oversight of it. And while he was at it, Mike Hosking was accusing other media of looking for complaints to fit their alleged contrary narrative. Now, back on February the 14th, the day the School Lunch Collective had to buy in pies and wraps for lunch, Mike Hosking told listeners he was reluctant to give the story airtime, and then he asked the School Lunch Collective boss Paul Harvey,
has the media run a witch hunt on you?
We're aware of the media conversation, but candidly, Mike, I'm just focusing on what we need to do, right?
Though Mike Hosking did go on to accuse Paul Harvey of a breach of contract.
You saw a contract worth millions and you went, I'm in, robber's dog, $3 a meal, can't go wrong, it has gone wrong, you got too excited basically.
No, not at all. The collective is a collaboration of some amazing suppliers, manufacturers and partners that care about ensuring that our tamariki and our kids get meals every day.
And 2 weeks ago, on the verge of having a child himself, congratulations Jack and Marva, Jack Tame told his ZB listeners this.
For all the concern over the state of the books, the savings made from the school lunch program are worth nothing if the kids don't eat.
True enough, and working back from that point you'd think would be the point for all concerned at this point. Well, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week looking back at the week's news and media. If you have any thoughts to share with us in the meantime, or any ideas for us to follow up, or you spot anything you think we should know about in the media, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X. And you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123, Wellington. Hayden Donnell will be back with next Wednesday's Midweek Media Watch. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.